All right, let's go to what's becoming more apparent by the day. Businesses who've been hesitant to criticise the Albanese government's energy strategy are now becoming more and more emboldened to speak out. The latest broadside comes from Glencore CEO Gary Nagle, who's urging the government to slow its transition to renewables, with Australia's energy costs now double or more than that of comparable countries like the States and Canada, even China and India. Joining me now to discuss this and more, environmental editor at The Australian, Graham Lloyd. Well, Graham, Nagle goes on to say that outside Australia, stakeholders, he says, are more than willing to at least consider coal. And here in Australia, coal is demonised despite our abundance of it. It seems counterintuitive, but he's right, I think, in calling out the cost of production, the cost of energy here in Australia when compared to countries like our own overseas.
That's right. Good evening, Peter. It's certainly one of the great ironies that the more that environment groups have demonised gas, the more they've ensured that coal will have a longer duration life in the energy systems around the world. It's what we've seen in Europe when Russian gas was turned off. The reflex was to return to coal as the alternative that works. So companies everywhere are now much more pragmatic. We reached a peak in virtue probably a couple of years ago. Now the big investment houses are saying, well, for all the talk about fossil fuels being pushed out of the system, the use of coal in particular continues to grow, emissions continue to grow, and that's just a fact of economic life.
You've got to love the righteous climate zealots, you know, at the COP meeting, the UN's COP29. This is in Azerbaijan. We're in the final week now. 70,000 delegates, Graham, 70,000 delegates go over there on their private planes and commercial aircraft. I don't think many of them took a car or a camel to get to Baku. How many delegates did we send from Australia? Because I remember in the past, the costs were in the tens of millions of dollars in the Kevin Rudd era. And how much, if we are, the decision is to Australia to host COP31 in 2026, how many millions and millions will that cost us then?
Well, the one thing that's certain is this is not a cheap undertaking, and the irony is the number of attendees from any country pretty much is determined by whether they're a contributor or a beneficiary from the money that's going to be handed out. So you see some of the biggest delegations from some of the least developed nations, and developed countries are trying to stay away. With the exception of Australia, of course, where we're sort of boots in for this meeting. We have a delegation that would be very substantial. The DFAT hasn't published an actual list of who's there, but you can be sure it will be costing millions. And that is only part of the money we've been spending, because, of course, as part of diplomacy and trying to get everybody on board for a climate conference of our own, we've had climate ambassadors flying all over the world for the past year trying to drum up support. So these costs are very substantial before we even get to the point of showing how much we care by what we plan to contribute to the Green Climate Fund.
It's like the worst of the excesses that people used to spend up big trying to win the Olympics or the World Cup football game. Here we are spending and emitting many hundreds of millions of dollars to get this Talkfest to Australia. What about this $1.8 trillion a year fund? This will just be a slush fund for climate change. I was horrified to hear that Chris Bowen is a co-chair of this fund in its negotiations at COP. How much is that going to cost us? How many billions are we on the hook for here, Graham?
Well, this is the core of this meeting in Baku. They're calling it the Finance COP because they believe that they dealt last time with the fact, well, we won't be using coal anymore. So they're moving on now to basically what's been at the heart of the COP process, which is the distribution of funds from the developed world to the developing. So the figure that has been put out there by China on behalf of a group of 70 7 developing countries is that it should be 1.3 trillion US dollars per year, starting from around the 2030s. And in the past, the United States has always been assumed it will be paying at least half of that. Australia's contribution will be about 4 to 5%. But of course, if Donald Trump pulls out, that leaves a big hole in the funding capacity. And certainly the demand for the money is still there, and it leaves those who are left in the system further on the hook.
You're not wrong. And of course, China is, under COP rules, a developing nation. So it's got its hand in the cookie jar as well. Thanks very much, Graham.